What's up, guys? I just thought I would jump in here and comment a little bit on today's Tour de France finish with Peter Sagan basically moving Wout van Aert out of the way in the final sprint, and what the difference is between that and what happened prior with the sprint finish with Gründal in Tour of Poland. Okay, so basically what happened in Tour of Poland was the rider that had the lead moved over and impeded and pushed the rider that was behind into the barrier and specifically crashed them. When the rider was in front, they had the handlebars in front of the other rider. They actually moved over and hit the handlebars into the barrier and took the rider off their center of balance, completely changed their line, and crash them into the barrier. The specific rules state that you're not allowed to change your line in the sprint. So that was that context. What we saw today is we saw Peter Sagan come from behind, did not change his line, shot straight up the side against the barrier in the peloton, and then he used his shoulder and elbow to hit Wout van Aert from behind and move him forward and slightly over, so Sagan then could come from behind and contest the sprint. Had he not done that, he wouldn't have been able to sprint because Wout van Aert already had the line and was basically between him and the barrier. So here's the problem, right? Is Peter Sagan got DQ'd for this particular move. Now, this particular move is a common move that every single rider in the peloton does all day long. There's the quack, was what we saw before with Gründal, was when your handlebars are in front of the other rider, you move them over, okay? That happens all day long. It's not allowed to happen in the sprint because of the rules. That's the quack. That's what happens. And the reason for that is people are high stakes, high speed, high heart rate, high intensity riders are unable to react. Sagan, on the other hand, comes from behind and moves Wout forward and over by bumping into his hip. Is the safest way to move someone in the peloton, and it's what happens all day long. If you are unable to do that, you're unable to go through the peloton. Now, we've seen, days before, we've seen Ewan scoot all through the peloton. This is the same maneuver that he's doing. If you bump into the hip and you move the hip, the rider that's ahead of you safely gets pushed out of the way. You're able to fill the hole. It's the most common move in the World Tour peloton. If you're unable to do that, you can't move through the peloton. It's impossible because people are so good at bike riding. They handle their bikes so well. They'll constantly quack you. You won't be able to move without doing that. So this is what I already said, but the problem with this is that if you penalize Sagan for this move, then there's not a response to the other move, is when someone moves their handlebars over on you. Now, if one is banned and the other's banned, then basically whatever position you are, you have to stay there for the entire race, because there's no way to move unless the rider in front of you moves out of the way for some reason. But on these European roads with these high-level riders with really good fitness and strong legs and amazing bike handling skills, it's not possible. So my argument is that if Sagan gets penalized for this move, then you have to penalize it for everyone, and you have to write it in the rules that say you're not allowed to bump riders. But we've seen bumping happen all day, every single day in the peloton. Crosswind days before. How do the riders like Sagan and Wout van Aert and all these other riders, how do they constantly finish in the front group in these echelons? This is how they do it. They come from behind, and if there's not a hole, they hit the rider with their elbow or their, their shoulder and the hip, and that moves that rider out of the way safely. Okay, there's no other way to safely do it. The rules specifically state that you're not allowed to take your handlebar off the bar, or your hand off the handlebar. Had Sagan took his hand off the handlebar and used his hand to push Wout van Aert out of the way, then this would have been penalized. But he didn't. He kept his hands on the handlebars. He's such a good bike rider that he continued to sprint. He checked Wout van Aert from behind. So Wout didn't shoot off to the side. Again, he hit him from behind a little bit, so he moved him forward and a little bit diagonal. So it was a totally safe, very professional move. Yeah, it's rough and it's tumble, but that's the sport. When I was in the Tour de France as a climber, I hated it because I wasn't as good as those other riders, but I had to learn how to do it. In fact, some of the best riders at this particular move that Sagan did today were the Schlecks. I used to call that move being Schlecked, where the Schlecks, they would just come up from behind and just run into, they could swim upstream, right? Like a salmon, and the Schlecks would just come up through the peloton and boom, elbow here, elbow there, into the hip, and people would just move out of the way, and he was just like, oh, you've been schlecked. Well, okay, I've been schlecked. Fair game. You schlecked me out of the way. I don't know what to do. There's not a really, it's such a good move that there's not really a good retaliation against getting schlecked. In this case, Sagan did the schleck, moved him out of the way, beat him. And it, I think it's mind-boggling that he got penalized for this. When it's been going on for years and years and years, and the rules are that you can't deviate from your line. Well, he didn't deviate for his line, so now is the rule you can't deviate for your line and you can't bump people. I mean, guys, UCI or whoever you are, make the rule. If you make the rule, all of a sudden the whole sport completely changes. Now you're unable to move and pass. It's a thing that we practice in every single race. The Cat 5 people are in grass fields learning how to bump into one another. It's just, again, this is just the UCI flexing their power and authority and saying, look, we can penalize and throw out everyone. It was Alaphilippe for the bottle, which that's a rule that's written in here. Sagan's thing is no rule. And if now I think they need to make a rule that says you cannot make contact. You can't bump, and that's going to change everything because, just think about every sprint finish, the people fighting behind the sprinter that has the lead out train, they're bumping. They're nonstop bumping. It's nonstop. And now can you do that? Can you not do it? Who knows? Again, just this, here's another example of just fairy tale rule making, rule interpretation. It's just ridiculous. And it just makes our sport look like a complete joke, I think. And I think, again, had Sagan bumped and changed his line and pushed Wout into the barrier or into Caleb Ewan, yeah, but he hit him in such a way that he didn't even impede Bennett, who was 1 inch to his left. You can't do it any better than Peter Sagan did it. I doubt Wout was like, oh my gosh, that jerk. He was probably like, wow, that was an amazing move you just did there, Sagan. Respect, So I think it's strange and disappointing. And I think that, it just goes that these people with the power are just more interested in their power. And that cost Sagan the green jersey probably there. So pretty bad decision, I think. Very similar to the Alaphilippe one, but even a step more in the direction of ridiculous, as there is no real rule against what he did. And if you're doing this, now UCI or whoever you are, you need to enforce it everywhere. No bumping, which means no bike racing, which means, basically you're going to have a bike parade, right? So just get in the front for the parade and hold your ground, and no one can even move because you can't change your line and you can't bump people. So, I think the solution is safer finishes and barriers, and then penalizing people when they make malicious line changes that crash people and force them out of safety. But in this case, this was professional. This was a common move that's done all the time in the Tour de France for position for climbing, for position to get in breakaways, for position to sprint, for position to get on lead-out trains, for position to get in the front for crosswinds, for positioning to get in front on downhills. It's a retaliation to the quack, right? The quack is one thing. Put your handlebars in front, move over on them. That's one move. This is a way to get out of the quack, which is bump the hip from behind and move the rider out of the way. And he did it, again, safely, forward and diagonally. So he didn't impede Bennett. He didn't come off. He didn't even wobble. It was so well done. There was no, again, I think it's wild, crazy, ridiculous. That's my thoughts. I'm sure all of you or someone will comment on here and say, how can a climber comment on sprinting? He doesn't know anything, whatever. Go ahead and comment away. This is my feelings. And there they are. I think it was ridiculous. I think it was a poor move. And now I think, they need to enforce this. If this is the rule, then they need to enforce this rule everywhere and turn the Tour de France into a parade. It'll be safer. That's one thing for sure. If you make the Tour de France or bike racing a bike parade, just get in front, have your team ride on the front. Can't pass. Bike parade. All right, later.